back everyone to another video in our series on how to make a platformer game in Unity. I'm Mike Page with scriptingisfun.com, and in this part 4 of our video we're going to be working on setting up some animations in our game. So let's get right back to our game and set up all the animations that we have. Alright, currently in our game, when we play, our player has one animation that he's doing, and that's just the idle animation that we gave him when we first brought him in. So our goal today is to get him walking and jumping. We'll get those animations done. We'll also talk about how to make him face a different direction when he's walking in different directions. Right now, of course, he's always just facing to the right. So let's actually start with that first. Let's get him, depending on which way we're moving, facing in the direction that he is moving. In our player script, we're going to need to make a few changes here to get him to flip around. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to flip his sprite. So if I go, let's go back out to Unity here for a second. If I go to my player and I look up here at his sprite renderer, in the sprite renderer you see there's this thing called flip. And if I flip it on the x-axis, you'll see that he changes direction. So what we're really doing is we're just flipping the sprite. We're not doing anything else. So the sprite here that's being drawn on the screen, we can zoom in on him a little bit here in the scene view. And let me just put the move tool on. So you can see here's his orientation. He's facing to the right on the x-axis. When I flip it, it just changes his sprite. It doesn't change the direction that the game object is pointing. Now, so one of the problems we'll see when we flip him is he isn't staying in the center of his collider. So what we're going to do in this case is we're just going to adjust that collider a little bit so that it works for both directions. So if I go over to this side, let's just drag, go to our collider, hit edit collider. Let's go ahead and just drag this a little bit wider. And then when we flip it back, let's go ahead and drag this in this way just a little bit. We'll just get kind of the back of his head here. Flip it again here now. Something like this. We can maybe go a little bit further this way. And really, I don't think we'll see too much of a weird graphical thing here with this. Just one way to kind of make the collider fit both ways, just to keep things kind of simple. So I think we'll be okay like this. One way to avoid this is when you draw your sprites, try to make sure you do a good job of centering them. So if you flip them on the axis here, they won't go off the center point. But this works okay for what we have today. Okay, so we've adjusted our collider. We've talked about how when we want to use this flip X of the sprite renderer to actually cause our guy to flip. So when he's moving to the right, we want flip X to be false, so that he's in his default orientation. And when we're moving to the left, we want to toggle that flip X to true. So let's see how to do that in our script. Let's get a link to our sprite renderer here. So we can just do a private sprite renderer. And we'll just call it sprite renderer. Like that. And then we can go ahead on our start function here. Just like we're getting the rigid body, let's just make our sprite renderer here equal to get component. And then what do we want? We want the sprite renderer component. So we'll just go ahead and establish that connection right away. Then we can just always access the sprite renderer because the flipX property is in the sprite renderer component. So now that we have a link to that, we can go down here and we can just check to see which way our player is moving. So if you remember, we're getting this horizontal input. We're getting that from our keys, so we can see which way we're moving. And then we're using that down here to move our character. We're moving here by horizontal. So after we move him, we can just check to see if this is a positive or a negative value. Because remember, horizontal is coming off our get axis, and the get axis is a directional input axis. So if we're on a key that's moving us to the right, we're going to get a positive number. It's going to be a positive 1. If we're moving to the left, we get a -1. So if it's positive, we're going to the right. If it's negative, we're going left. So we can use that to control when we should flip. So let's make a little space right here. We'll just do this right here. We'll just say flip the sprite to face the direction he is moving. Alright, so we can just say if horizontal, if that is greater than, let's give it a small number like 0.01. So if we're moving it all to the right, because remember a positive number goes to the right, then let's make sure that sprite renderer, so we're going to go to our sprite renderer variable here, and then we're going to say dot flip x, and we'll set that equal to false. Because remember, when he's going to the right, he's already in the direction that he was drawn. So we don't want a check mark in the box. So false means don't put a check mark in the box. And then we can put let's see, another check here, because we want to make sure if he's at 0, we don't want to change the direction he's facing. So we actually have to kind of make two separate checks here. So we'll also just do another check here then. We'll say if horizontal is less than, and then we'll say a -0.01. So if he's moving it all to the left, then what we want to do is same thing, sprite renderer, and we want flip x, and this time we want to set it equal to true, which will cause it to flip the sprite so he's facing to the left. So if he's moving right, we make sure he's to the right, we're not flipping. If he's moving left, we make sure we check that in, set it to true so that he does flip. We'll save this and test this out. Alright, so we move to the right, he stays to the right. If I move to the left, he now flips to the left. If I don't move at all, he stays facing in the last direction he was facing. So there we go. And if you look up here in the sprite renderer, right where I've got my mouse, right now flip x is not checked. When I go to the left, it checks in. So it's checking off and on here using code. So that's how we can get him to flip. So now he's flipping the face the right way. Now let's start working on our animation. So let's see if we can get a walk animation in here. In our sprite sheet, so let's go here to our sprite sheet, and we want to find our walking sprites. So we have 4 sprites here. If we look in our sprite editor here, we've got these 4 sprites here. So we can look to see what those are. These are labeled here, these are named, and they start at 16, 17, 18, and 19. So these are the 4 sprites that we want. So let's go back here and find 16 through 19. That's our walk cycle here when there is no weapon equipped. So we can go into our sprite sheet here, and we're looking for 16. Here we go, 16, 17, 18, and 19. Now what we want to do is we want to select our player, and we want to go to the animation window. So here you can see on your player he's got an idle animation already, and that's what's loaded up, and there's 2 sprites in here, and we just set it to a speed of 4 frames per second so that he bounces up and down at the speed we want. If we want to add a new clip here, then what we're going to do is we're going to say create new clip. So I just clicked right here where it said player idle. It's a little drop down. I'm going to hit create new clip. It's going to take me out here to name this animation, so we're just going to call this walk. And let's save this in our player animations folder that we set up. Here's player idle animation. Now we're making, actually since we're naming it this way, let's just name it the same. We'll call it player walk, and we'll hit save. You see now we've got a new empty animation called player walk. What I can do now is I can grab these 4 frames and drag them down into my animation. So I'm going to click on the first one, I'm going to go down to the last one and shift click it. So now all 4 are clicked, and you can see over here on the side they're also showing, and then I'm going to drag those down and just drop them in my timeline. Now it's going to put them in frames all next to each other. Now what we're going to want to do next here is if we go to our player and we go into his player controller, We got a controller automatically when we first dragged him in because we dragged him in with an animation. So if I double click that, I can go here to my player controller here, and you see this is his default state. So the orange one is the default one. It plays automatically. It's set right now to be an idle. We can change that temporarily to walk. So if I right click there and say set layer default state, this will start him with his walk animation. And if I hit play, let's just see what happens. And you can see it's playing his animation, but look how fast it's going. So he's like kind of going crazy here. So let's stop that. So let's go back to our animation panel. The reason for that is we're playing this at 60 frames per second. He's only got 4 frames of animation. We've got them all smashed together. So I could select these and drag them out and space them out so they're the same space apart, or I could just slow the sample rate down. So let's try putting it at something like a 4, and you'll see now that that spaced this out. So right now it's doing like 4 frames per second, and that might be too slow, but let's just take a look and see what it looks like. And we can actually hit the play button here. So that's what that looks like now. So that might be a little bit too slow. Let's we can kind of test that by going into play mode here and seeing if the speed we've set him at is too fast for his animation. So you can see he's in this default walk animation here right now. So as I move him, it almost looks a little too slow, I think, for how fast we're moving him. So what we can do then is we can just play with this right here. Let's go ahead and set that to an 8 instead. Now let's see if that's too fast. Let's click in here. It almost looks like he's running there, huh? That might be okay. Maybe we'll leave it 8 for now. We can always go in and tweak this later. So there we go. It remembered the change. So we're at 8 frames per second here. We'll just leave it like that. So now we have a walk animation. I'm going to go back to the animator controller here. So now what we need to do is work on getting it to transition between the idle and the walk. So making it switch these animation states. So I'm going to right click here on player idle and make this the default state again, because I do want him to idle by default. But I do want him to switch between walking and idling depending on if he's moving or not. So I'm going to right click on idle and I'm going to make a transition. I'm going to drag this arrow out and click on player walk. This now has made a way for me to transition from idle to walk. I also want to be able to go back, so I'm going to right click player walk, make a transition back to player idle. So now I have transitions. Now if I click on one of the transition arrows, you'll see that I have some properties I can set here. And I need to tell it when it can move back and forth. So it has an exit time check. That means that it would wait till all the way to the end of the player idle, and then it would go to the walk. And this one is set for exit time. It would wait all the way to walk and go back. We don't want it to do that. We want it to immediately transition when we start moving from idle to walking. And when we stop moving, we want it to immediately transition back. So that means that we need to set up what's called a parameter. So over here in my animator, there's a parameter tab that's clicked in, and I want to add a parameter. There's 4 types of parameters we can add. We can use a float, integer, boolean, or trigger. In this case, we're going to use a float because we're going to use that horizontal input number that we're getting when we push the keys to see which way he is going. So, and that's giving us a float number between a -1 and a +1. So I'm going to make a float, and I'm going to give it a name. We'll just call this speed. Now that I've got that, I'm going to go here to my transition from idle to player walk. I'm going to uncheck has exit time because I don't want it to wait until the idle animation is played a complete loop before it transitions. I want it to go right away. Under conditions here now, I can add speed. And I can say, okay, I want to go from idle to walking when my speed is greater than, and let's just give it a small number like a 0.01. So as soon as I start moving, I want it to start walking. Okay? I can go now to the transition back from walking to idling, and I can do the same thing. I don't want it to wait till it's done with the walk cycle. I want it to go back right away, so I'm going to uncheck has exit time. I'm going to hit plus here under condition. I'm going to use speed, but this time I want it when it's less than the 0.01. So that means that we're not moving and we've stopped. Okay? So now I've set this parameter up called speed. I've set up my transitions and my conditions here so that it knows what I want it to do. Now I just have to go into my code and I have to send to the animator here what the speed is every frame so that it knows which animation it should be playing. So I'm going to save my scene here by doing Control S. Let's go back into Visual Studio, and somewhere in here, once we are moving, we just need to tell it to send to the animator that our speed. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is get a link to our animator component. So I'm going to go up here to my variables again. I'm just going to make an animator, and this is called this anim. And then just like I've done for these other components here, I'm just going to have the script go ahead and use get components to get these. The other way you could do this is you could make these all public and then you could drag it in the inspector. But for this one here, this is kind of use some code here. So I'm going to now fill anim. I'm going to say, okay, go out to this object that we're attached to here, and I want you to get an animator component. Since there's only one, it'll go out and find the animator component attached to our player, which the script is attached to, and it will fill that in. So now I have access to the animator through this variable anim, and I can then send and set its parameters. So after I get my horizontal input here, then I'm moving, I'm seeing if I should flip, and somewhere in here we also want to just set our animation. So we can do that right here, I suppose. We could do it here, we could do it up here under the transform translate, somewhere in here. So let's just make a note here. I'm going to set the speed parameter of the animator so that we can control if we should be walking or idling. So we go to our animator, which is known as anim here, that variable we set up. We say anim dot, and then what we're going to do is we're going to set a float. We want to set a float parameter. So we're going to say set float, and then in here we have to tell it the name of our parameter as a string, and then give it a value. So in quotes here, I'm going to say speed. That's exactly how I spelled it in my animator controller. And then a comma. And the value I want it to set is my horizontal. But I want to make sure that I get the absolute value of my horizontal. Because remember, horizontal, if I'm moving to the right, is a positive number. If I'm moving left, it's a negative number. My parameters right now say that if I've got a positive movement to walk and if I have a negative movement to idle. So I need to tell speed that if there's any movement left or right at all, to walk. So I can do that by just doing the Mathf.Abs, and then let's feed it horizontal. And now it doesn't matter if I'm moving left or right. I'm going to get a positive number because I'm taking the absolute value of horizontal, and I'm going to send that to the speed. I'm going to set that speed float to that number. Alright, so let's save this and I'll show you what this is doing over in Unity. So we'll keep this window open here so we can see which animation is playing. Let's hit play. Alright, so right now you can see that it's playing idle. If I start moving to the right, it switches to walk. If I stop moving, it went back to idle. Now, if I go to the left, it switches back to walk, and as soon as I stop, it goes back. So you see now we can make him go between idling and walking in both directions. If you look here in your parameter list, see speed, it's got a number there. When I move to the right, see how that number went to 1, and when I stop, it goes back to 0. When I go to the left, it also goes back to 1, and when I let go, it stops at 0. If I hadn't taken the absolute value, when I'm moving to the left, I would have went to a negative number. And then according to my transition here, value less than a positive 0.01, so anything less than that would make me go back to idle. That's why I did the absolute value, so that I just have one check here basically that I'm making to see if I should be walking or not. So we've got our idle to our walking animation working here. So there we go. We got that part done. The next thing we want to do is work on jumping. So when we jump, we want our guy to play his jump animation. We want him to hold that animation until he's no longer jumping. So let's go back into our script here and see what we have so far. So for jumping here, if you remember, we're checking to see if our velocity, we did it right here, we did a check if we didn't want to have air control. We were checking the rigid body's velocity in the y-axis to see if it was greater than a 0.01. So that's the same kind of check here, and it's absolute value because the velocity, if we're moving down, would be negative and up would be positive. So we want to make sure that we know if we're moving up or down at all, then we're jumping or falling, and that we wanted to take air control away. We can use the same kind of an idea here for jumping. So if our rigid body's velocity is bigger than 0, then we want to be jumping. If it's not, then we don't want to be jumping, right? Then we want to be idling or walking or whatnot. So that's kind of the strategy that we're going to go after. So out in Unity, let's go ahead and set the animation up first here. So let's go to our animation window. We want to make sure our player is selected. You can see right here that we've got player walk, player idle. Let's go to create clip and let's make player jump. And save that in our player animation folder. And then let's find the sprite for that. So if we go back to our sprite sheet, we want to find the one where he's jumping. So let's open that up. Let's make a little more space here so we can see this a little better. So jump. So here's jump. There's just one frame of animation for jump. We're just going to switch him into this kind of a jump pose. So again, I'm going to grab it and I'm going to drag and drop it down here in the timeline. And now he's just going to be jumping. Okay? So that's his jump animation. That's all we needed there to set up that animation. If we go to our animator controller here now, we're going to see that player jump is now in here. So I'm just going to kind of put that up here for the moment. So what we want to have happen is at any time when we're in the game, walking, idling, whatever, and we hit the jump key, we want to immediately go to our jump animation. So what we're going to do is we're going to transition from this any state button here. This any state button means that it can interrupt anything else that's going along. So if we're in idle or walk at this point and we get a jump, we're going to interrupt those animations and we're going to automatically transition to player jump. So I'm going to right click any state, make a transition to player jump. Now my transition arrow here, I click that. We don't want to have an exit time here. There is one thing we want to do, and that is whenever you go from any state, you almost always want to go here to can transition to self and uncheck it. Because if not, this animation will sometimes stutter. It'll kind of keep trying to play the animation and start it all over again. So we want this just to kind of transition one time to jumping. Since it's only one frame, we want to go ahead and have it hold that frame until we're no longer jumping. When we're no longer jumping, we want to go back to our idle animation, idle animation. And then from there, if we start moving left or right, it'll automatically transition to walk. So from any state, we're going to jump. Now we have to give it a condition to jump on because right now it doesn't have one. So I'm going to make another parameter here to control if I should be jumping or not. So since I don't know exactly when a jump is going to end, I'm going to actually set up an animation parameter here that's a Boolean. So that when we are jumping, I can set this to true and leave it true until we're no longer jumping, at which point we can set it to false. So let's just call this jumping. And so we have our parameter here jumping. And now over here in my transition, I can select that. So I can go to the plus sign, I can find jumping, and I can say when jumping is true, then transition to player jump. I can now make a transition from player jump by right-clicking it, make transition back to idle, click on that transition, and again, we don't need an exit time here because we're going to just immediately transition back, and the condition will be jumping, and it'll be if it's false. So as soon as jumping is false in this parameter here, it's going to transition back to player idle. Alright, so that's the setup here. So we made the animation, we hooked it in here with some transitions, we made a new parameter called jumping, and we set the conditions when it should go back and forth. Now we're ready to go back into our script. Okay, so what we want to do here is, first of all, we need to have a button that will trigger a jump, which we have here, right? So right now we're already saying if we push the jump button, which is the space bar currently, and if our absolute value of our rigid body on the Y is less than a 0.01, then we're going to jump. That's how we got around the double jump type of a thing, and we're adding force to do that jump. So because of how this works, we kind of need to separate this out. So we want to make another check here every frame. We're going to basically find out, are we already jumping? And if we're not already jumping and our velocity is bigger than the small number here on the Y, then we want to go to jumping. Okay, so we can find out what the state of our animation is by accessing the animator and getting the value. So for jumping, it's a Boolean, right? So if we are jumping, we want to set that to true, but we only want to do it if we aren't already jumping, okay? Because we just don't want to keep spamming the animator all the time. This might be a little more performant to do it this way. So I'm going to go to the animator through anim, and this time I'm going to say get bool. So I'm going to get a Boolean parameter. Now I have to give it the name of the parameter that I'm looking for, and if you remember, that was jumping. So basically, if I say anim get bool jumping, since jumping is a Boolean parameter, it's going to return to me a true or a false. If this is true, then it would do the things below. I actually want to know if it's false, because I want to go from not jumping to jumping. So if you want to check to see if something is false instead, you can just put an exclamation point in front of it. Exclamation point means not. So now I'm saying if we're not jumping, okay, so if this comes back as false, it'll say not false. Well, not false is true, right? It flips it around, so this will make this go to true. So basically, if I'm not already jumping, okay, and then I have to do my second check, so I'm going to do two ampersands here. This means and, so I'm doing a compound conditional statement here. So first I got to check it, am I jumping right now? Does the animator think I'm jumping? If he doesn't think I'm jumping, then I'm going to check the velocity. So I can actually just kind of copy this little line right here and paste it in. So I'm saying if the absolute value of the rigid body on the Y, if that is greater than, we'll try a 0.01 here, we may have to adjust that later. If we're greater than that, then we are actually having movement on the Y-axis, either up or down. So now we know that we're not already jumping, but we should be jumping because this is true. So at this point then, let's go ahead and set the animator to tell it that we are jumping. So then we would go to anim, and then we're going to go to set bool, and the Boolean we want to set is jumping, and we have to tell it the value, and the value would be true. So we are now indeed jumping. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So basically I'm checking, is the animator already playing the jumping animation? If it's not, if we're not already playing that, and we should be because our velocity on the Y is greater than a small number here, then go ahead and jump. Alright, now we're going to get stuck here jumping until we turn this back to false. So let's go ahead and do that real quick as well. So underneath here then, we're going to ask another question. We're going to say, okay, if we are currently jumping, so it's kind of the reverse of this one here, right? So we can say if anim get bool jumping. So this time we're asking, are we jumping? So if the animator thinks we are jumping, and we can just copy this line here again. And this time we're going to ask, are we less than? And if the absolute value of our velocity on the y is less than the 0.01, then we shouldn't be jumping anymore. So then we're just going to do the same thing here. We can even just kind of copy this down, paste it in, and this time we're going to set it to false. And if I spell false right, that'll work. Okay, so every frame we're evaluating these two things. So if we push the jump button and we're not already jumping, then we add the force and we jump our guy. When he's jumping, that causes the rigid body's velocity on the y-axis to go to a number bigger than 0. And since we're doing absolute value here, we'll catch it for falling and jumping. Like for instance, if we fall off a platform, we also want to go to the jumping animation as well. It's one of the reasons why we kind of separated that from the actual jump button itself triggering the jumping animation to what the character is doing with its velocity on the y-axis. So if we're not currently jumping, if the animator says, nope, I'm not playing the jumping animation right now, and we should be because our velocity on the y is bigger than 0, then we're going to go ahead and set jumping to true, which will cause us to trigger the jumping animation. We'll also be checking every frame if we are currently jumping and our velocity has gone below that 0.01, then we want to set it back to false. Alright, so jumping is now going to be controlled by our velocity on the y-axis. Hopefully that makes a little more sense. Let's save this and test it out, make sure it works the way that we expect it to. Alright, so we can still walk. Now if I jump, I go to the jump pose, and when I stop jumping, I go to the not jump pose. See that? Now it's a little bit of a lag there. We can maybe fix that a little bit, but let's jump up here. Now if I fall, you notice how I go to the jump pose as well. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we wrote it that way, is that if we're falling, we go to that pose as well. And sometimes people will make a separate animation for falling, and then if you were going to do that, then you would want to check to see if you've got a negative or a positive motion. But in this one here, we just have one animation we're using for both. So that is how that is working. Now, one thing we could kind of fine-tune here, let's go here to our, let's make a little more room so we can see in here. So from any state to player jump, you see there's a little bit, let's go into settings here, there's a little bit of a transition duration, like 1/4 of a second. We could try turning that to 0 so that it just automatically transitions, it doesn't try to blend. And we could do that from here to idle as well. We could just uncheck fixed duration, and we can set that to 0. And let's just see if that makes it a little snappier here for our jumping. So let's hit play and try that out. Okay, so if I jump, there you notice how now it's immediate, and before there was a little bit of a lag. Now, we used a very small number here for our jumping amount. And for now it's working okay because all of our platforms are level. But if you put some objects in here that are rounded a little bit, it is possible that the computer will think we're jumping when we're actually still on the ground. So one thing we might want to do is change that number up a little bit. And that's something that we would just have to play with as we continue to develop our idea here. But I think I'm going to change this maybe to a 0.1 and a 0.1. Just so that if we get a little bit of movement up and down just from walking, we won't trigger our jump animation. So let's go back here. Let's just test it with a 0.1 and a 0.1 just to see if that's a little bit better. So I think that might make a little bit better of a difference here. We'll see. Now, one thing you do notice though, when I turn that down, is sometimes you'll see a little flutter at the very top where he flips. You can even see it down here in the animator controller. So let's take a look at that. When I jump, you notice sometimes there's a little flutter down here by player idle. See it? Not always, but sometimes. That's the problem that you get if you turn that too big. So maybe a 0.05 would be better than a 0.01. That's just what you have to play with. I think I'll just leave it as is for now, and we'll see what it looks like as we continue to develop. Alright, so we have in this video set up our basic animations. The only thing we haven't put in here yet is an attack animation. We'll add that in when we add attacking into the game. Alright everybody, so we've added our basic animations into our game here today. We put in our jumping animation, our walking animation, we've set up some parameters, we've showed in our coding how to go in and get those parameters and set those parameters, and the logic we need to control parameters in the animator controller. Hopefully you found that useful. And of course you can extend this into all sorts of other kinds of animations. We will be putting in some attack animations, and in this game we actually have 3 different modes our player can be in. He can have a sword, he can have a gun, or he can be unarmed. So we're going to look at how to switch between basically 3 sets of animations in here eventually as well. But that'll be for a later video. So for now, this is where we're going to stop. Enjoy playing with the animations. You could even try drawing out some of your own sprite animations if you like, or there's on the asset store, Unity Asset Store, there are some free sprite packs that you could use. Again, a big thank you to subscriber Chris Fritsch for making these sprites and animations for us. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. And I hope you're finding this useful. Have a great day.